Speaking of Southern Rhodesia, when we talk about Southern Rhodesia, the Prime Minister who quickly comes to mind is Ian Smith. But many often forget that there were 7 Prime Ministers before Ian Smith. These are Charles Coughlin, Howard Moffat, George Mitchell, Godfrey Huggins, Garfield Todd, Edgar Whitehead, and of course, Winston Field. But today, we want to find out why Ian Douglas Smith was more prominent than all these Rhodesian prime ministers put together. This is a story of a man who defied the whole world, leading a racist nation which was under UN and British sanctions, enduring 14 years of warfare surrounded by hostile countries. From UDI to the sanctions to the internal settlement, from the Lancaster House Conference in London to the 1980 elections to his fallout with Robert Gabriel Mugabe after independence. This is the story of the last white Rhodesian Prime Minister, Ian Douglas Smith. Ian Smith was the only Rhodesian Prime Minister born and raised in Rhodesia, modern-day Zimbabwe. Doesn't that make him Mwanawevu, son of the soil? I mean, he was even a war vet too. He fought in the second Chimurenga of white people in the World War II. But then again, he was fighting for the British, so I suppose he was a Mwanawevu in Britain. But then again, he wasn't born in Britain, so he surely can't be a Mwanawevu in Britain. So whose Ivu was he a Mwana of? This is confusing. Anyway, let's move on. Ian Smith was born on the 8th of April in 1919, 4 years before the establishment of Rhodesia's first responsible government. He was born in Shurugwi. His parents were amongst the early crop of white settlers who had initially come in search of gold, but later resorted to farming because there wasn't as much gold as anticipated. So, Ian Smith's family lived in Shurugwi, where he was born and raised. He attended Chaplin High School in Gweru, where he showed special interest in rugby, cricket, tennis, and athletics, later becoming the head prefect at that school. He pursued his tertiary education at Rhodes University in South Africa, where he soon developed political activism and abandoned his studies to join the British Air Force, where he became a fighter pilot. Ian Smith fought in the Second World War, twice almost losing his life. In fact, after one particular accident, his entire face had to be recomposed by plastic surgeons. So you see, after the war, Ian Smith returned to the Rhodes University, where he resumed his studies, later graduating with a Bachelor of Commerce degree. In 1948, Smith got married to the widow of a South African rugby player. Her name was Janet. Ahoy, my single mother, ahoy. You see, what actually happened was that Janet's husband, who I said was a South African rugby player, died in 1947. And in 1948, she visited Rhodesia together with her family. And as fate would have it, she got a job in Shurugwi, where she met her Prince Charming, Ian Smith. And they didn't waste time, no, they got married that very same year. Ahoy, my single mother, ahoy. A true definition of meant to be. Love was in the air, my fellow Sadzaitas. Ian Smith adopted their children and she would go on to give him 3 kids. And they lived happily ever after. At this point, I could end the video and say, well, thank you so much for watching. Please like and share. Marination, what. But hey, I still have to give you Ian Smith's political history and how he defied the whole world. Ian Smith joined politics in 1948 and became a member of parliament for his hometown, Shurugwi, under a party called the Liberal Party. He would later leave the Liberal Party in 1953, joining the United Federal Party, which was led by Edgar Whitehead. The United Federal Party won the Rhodesian elections in 1958, and Edgar Whitehead became the Rhodesian Prime Minister, and Ian Smith became the chief whip of that party in Parliament. But trouble soon broke out within the United Federal Party, with many people opposed to Prime Minister Edgar Whitehead's policies, which favored a gradual transition to majority rule. Ian Smith and Winston Field were especially opposed to the 1961 Constitution, which contained a Bill of Rights which had a wide range of new rights for all, blacks included. A lot of white people got agitated because they felt this would speed up the transition to black majority rule. This was during the era of Black Enlightenment and Afro-nationalism. You see, the independence of Ghana in 1957 inspired the whole continent. Blacks were now demanding a total and unconditional black majority rule. But Ian Smith and Winston Field were vehemently opposed to the idea of black majority rule because they believed it would bring total disaster economically, because blacks, the Africans, were not experienced at governing. But the Prime Minister at the time, Edgar Whitehead's policies favored a gradual transition to majority rule, a sentiment most whites disagreed with. And as a result, his party split, and this created a new party called the Rhodesian Front, led by Winston Field, who was deputized by Ian Douglas Smith. So, the Rhodesian Front participated and won the 1962 elections, and Winston Field became a Prime Minister elected to resist any attempts by the British government to grant majority rule to Southern Rhodesia, modern-day Zimbabwe. There was even talk of Southern Rhodesia breaking away from the authority of the UK by unilaterally declaring independence. You see, the UK had started the decolonization process and granting majority rule to its colonies. The Rhodesian Front was especially created to oppose this. In no time at all, Winston Field was seen as being not radical enough by whites, so they replaced him with Ian Douglas Smith in 1964. And Ian Smith wasted no time. In 1965, he broke away from the authority of the United Kingdom by unilaterally declaring independence, UDI. That means from November 1965, Rhodesia became an independent country, but without majority rule. The British government and the Commonwealth responded with sanctions. They established a sanctions committee whose function was to drive the sanctions agenda against Rhodesia. The Commonwealth Summit, held in Nigeria 1966, was primarily convened to discuss the Rhodesian issue. This summit resolved to request the United Nations to slap Rhodesia with more sanctions. An oil and trade embargo was soon imposed, and Rhodesian assets were frozen. The only countries which maintained open trade with Rhodesia were South Africa and Portugal. The British government ruled out the possibility of any military action against Rhodesia, believing that the sanctions would cripple and crumble Rhodesia in a matter of weeks. They couldn't have been more wrong, because the sanctions did the complete opposite to Rhodesia. If there is anything that the sanctions did to Rhodesia, is that they made Rhodesia self-sufficient. Because you see, even though agriculture was initially hard hit by the sanctions, the economy soon showed definite signs of recovery. The trade embargo had its greatest impact in 1966, but by 1969, Rhodesia had weathered the storm of sanctions. In 1968, Rhodesia's gross national income had surpassed the 1965 level. Remember, in 1965, that's when all the trouble started, when Ian Smith unilaterally declared independence, thereby inviting the sanctions. So, in 1968, Rhodesia's GNP surpassed the 1965 level and rose by another 11% in 1969. By the way, in that same year, exports rose for the first time since 1965. These are crazy stats for a country which was under UN sanctions. So, Rhodesians learned how to live with sanctions, and throughout Smith's tenure as Prime Minister, Rhodesia remained the second most developed African economy, second only to the mighty South Africa. In 1970, Ian Smith cut all ties with the British Crown when Rhodesia became a republic, with Smith himself as Prime Minister and Clifford DuPont as Rhodesia's first head of state, aka a president. Up until this point, Ian Smith had continued recognizing the Queen as the head of state of Rhodesia, though that reverence was not acknowledged by the Queen because of UDI. The British government, however, was engaged in continuous negotiations with Ian Smith to try and return Rhodesia to legality. Remember, Rhodesia under Ian Smith was unrecognized internationally from 1965 because of UDI. This continued under Abel Muzorewa. So, Ian Smith continued running Rhodesia against the wishes of the whole world, except South Africa and Portugal, of course. So that means the communists, China and Russia, the capitalists, America and her allies, the non-aligned movement, and of course the entire UN as a collective were against Ian Douglas Smith, yet he remained adamant and undeterred. Electorally speaking, his government maintained that only literate blacks who earned a certain amount of money were allowed to vote. In his actual words, and here I'm quoting him verbatim, he said, "We believe that democracy is a responsible thing, that people who take part in it should acknowledge this responsibility. And therefore, we have high qualifications, both education and financial. We don't like the idea of one man, one vote, and even if we did accept it, it would take quite a long time, I believe, where the average African would be sufficiently educated to be able to make an intelligent contribution. I believe that this should be something that should be evolutionary. I think you turn this into a revolution to your detriment." Those are the words of Ian Douglas Smith. Under his system of government in Rhodesia, you had to meet a certain income threshold and reach a certain level of education in order to earn the right to vote. The higher your educational level, the less income you were expected to meet for eligibility to vote. For example, you needed to have reached at least a Form 2 and earning about $1,800 per annum in order to be eligible to vote. And for someone with 4 years of secondary education, you needed to be earning about $1,200 per annum in order to be eligible to vote. Now, someone might say, well, $1,800, that's not a lot of money. Remember, this is 1969. That was a lot of money then. That money is today worth about $15,000 when adjusted by inflation. That means if that system still existed today, you would need to be earning about $15,000 a year in order to be eligible to vote. Already Uzumba, Maramba Pungwe and Chiredzi are automatically disqualified. Actually, when you consider the high rate of unemployment in Zimbabwe, plus the fact that most Zimbabweans live below the poverty datum line, you immediately realize that most Zimbabweans would be disenfranchised by this system. Very, very few people would be able to vote. So, under this system in Rhodesia, white people had 50 seats reserved for them, and black people had only 16 seats reserved for them in parliament. In 1965, this guy that you're looking at right now, Josiah Gondo, became the first black leader of the opposition in parliament after winning a majority of the 16 seats reserved for blacks. Realizing that sanctions had failed, the British government continued to negotiate with Ian Smith, and in 1971 they reached a constitutional settlement that would have legalized Smith's UDI in return for a new constitution which somewhat talked about a black majority rule, but at a distant future. Black people rejected this constitutional proposal via the Peace Commission. But keep in mind that as all of this was happening, ZAPU and ZANU were waging a protracted armed struggle against Ian Smith. And in 1974, the SADC leaders, who at the time were known as the Frontline States, together with the Americans and apartheid South Africa, decided to stop the war and try a negotiated settlement. Liberation movements were forced to unite under one party led by Bishop Abel Muzorewa. So negotiations with Ian Smith commenced, but nothing came out of it because Ian Smith was never really interested in any settlement that involved or included ZANU and ZAP. After the failure of the talks, Joshua Nkomo wrestled power from Bishop Abel Muzorewa and became president of the ANC. He soon started negotiating with Ian Smith with the support of Kenneth Kaunda, who represented the Frontline States. But again, nothing came out of it because Ian Smith was never really interested. The end result was that Ian Smith missed a golden opportunity, a grand opportunity to reach an internationally accepted settlement with the moderate Muzorewa and the less radical Joshua Nkomo. This, in my opinion, was one of Ian Smith's biggest blunders, because this blunder changed the political trajectory of Zimbabwe forever. Because if Ian Smith had signed a political settlement with either Muzorewa or Nkomo, this would have stopped the war. Any army that would have gone on with the war after that would have been treated as a rebel army and would not have been allowed to set up its military bases anywhere in Southern Africa. So it's fair to assume that a settlement with either Muzorewa or Nkomo would have ended the war, and that would possibly mean that maybe Chitepo wouldn't have died, maybe Tongogara wouldn't have died, maybe Alfred Nikita Mangena wouldn't have died, maybe Gukurahundi wouldn't have happened, or maybe independent Zimbabwe's first government would have had a balanced mixture of the experienced but acceptable Rhodesian elements and the most qualified blacks from the liberation movements, which would have ensured that the standards don't quickly go down. So Smith would have gotten what he always wanted: the maintenance of a good standard of living. So, in my humble submission, Ian Smith was very myopic, because in his defense of temporary power, he lost permanent security. He lost track of the bigger picture. That Rhodesia was going to crumble was inevitable. It was just a matter of time. You see, the independence of Mozambique in 1975 meant that Rhodesia was now surrounded by hostile neighboring countries, with the exception of South Africa. But even the South Africans ended up pressuring Ian Smith to consider the idea of majority rule, albeit with moderate blacks. This is what led to the internal settlement which Smith signed in March 1978 with Bishop Abel Muzorewa, Dabaningi Stole, and Chief Jeremiah Chirao. Smith hoped that the internal settlement would get international recognition, thereby discrediting and outmaneuvering the Patriotic Front of ZAPU and ZANU, which was waging a protracted armed struggle against his regime. The internal settlement established an executive council which ran the affairs of Rhodesia for 1 year, in which period a new constitution was crafted and approved by a nearly whites-only referendum. This is what led to the elections which were held in 1979, which ushered in a new government led by Prime Minister Bishop Abe Muzorewa. Rhodesia's name was changed to Zimbabwe Rhodesia. However, as I said before, it remained unrecognized until December 1979, when Governor Lord Solms took over after the Lancaster House Agreement. In Zimbabwe's first democratic elections in 1980, Smith's party, the Rhodesian Front, had 20 seats reserved for it by the Lancaster House Constitution. However, this reservation was repealed by the 1987 constitutional amendment, which also abolished the post of Prime Minister, creating the new role of an executive president. This is how Prime Minister Robert Mugabe became President Robert Mugabe. Initially, Mugabe and Smith's relationship was cordial. The two of them occasionally met as Mugabe was keen to know what the whites were thinking. However, their relationship would soon break down as Smith's public criticism of government increased, particularly his vehement opposition to Mugabe's proposal of a one-party state. What followed was over 2 decades of a cat-and-mouse relationship between Smith and Mugabe, with the former often getting into trouble with the authorities, twice getting his passport confiscated and his farm raided by ZANU-PF activists, though this would always end up getting resolved. Ian Smith remained in Zimbabwe until old age, declaring that he was Zimbabwean and not British. He died on the 20th of November 2007 in South Africa, where he had gone to seek medical attention. Now, to all those who are still engaged in this debate of whether Ian Smith was way better than the current Zimbabwean president, Emmerson Mnangagwa, well, I have given you all the information. So now you can debate from an informed position. As you know, Taffy the Man is all about information. I'm on a mission to inform the nation. Now give me an ululation. And as always, thank you so much for watching. And if you enjoy the content, please like and share.